I never expected that night to change my life. If you'd asked me a week earlier what my biggest concern was, I'd probably say something like making it through work without wanting to quit or figuring out how to spice things up with my wife, Jen. But life's funny like that. One minute, you're scrolling your phone on the couch in sweatpants, bored out of your mind, and the next, your world flips upside down because of a knock at the door. Let me back up. That night started as a throwaway night. Jen was out of town for a work conference, and our marriage had hit that stale point where her absence didn't even make me miss her. I don't say that to be cruel, it's just the truth. We'd been married for 8 years, and things were predictable. We still loved each other, but we were living more like roommates than lovers. Separate bedtimes, lukewarm dinners, minimal physical contact. I wasn't cheating on her or even thinking about it. Well, not seriously, but I'd be lying if I said I hadn't fantasized about excitement, about someone seeing me the way Jen used to. So there I was, scrolling through my phone, half watching some action movie when my best friend Tom texted me, "Tom, why don't you come out for a few drinks tonight? You need it." Me. Can't. Jen would kill me if she found out. Tom. Dude, she's not even home. One night won't kill you. I hovered over the keyboard, considering it. I needed a break from everything, even if it was just a few beers. But then the guilt crept in. Jen and I weren't doing great, and I figured sneaking off to drink wasn't exactly the way to fix things. Me. Nah, man, I'm good. But thanks. He didn't reply, and I went back to mindlessly scrolling. About an hour later, the boredom hit its peak. I found myself searching for something, anything to feel alive. That's when a bad idea crept in. One of those ideas that feels innocent enough until you realize how slippery the slope can get. I grabbed my phone and opened an old hookup app I hadn't touched in years, more out of curiosity than anything else. I wasn't looking to cheat. I just wanted the thrill of someone flirting back. That little rush. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Within minutes, I was swiping through profiles, feeling that old spark of excitement. I even matched with someone, some 20-something named Sierra, who immediately messaged me something flirty. But before the conversation could get past surface-level banter, my stomach twisted with guilt. What the hell was I doing? Closed the app and tossed my phone aside. That's when the knock came. It startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was maybe Tom had ignored my refusal and shown up anyway, ready to drag me out for drinks. But when I opened the door, it wasn't Tom standing there. It was her, Mrs. Reynolds, Tom's mom. Now, here's the thing about Mrs. Reynolds. She wasn't your typical middle-aged woman. She was one of those women who somehow aged in reverse, like her late 40s had only made her more radiant. Tall, elegant, with the kind of confidence that made her presence impossible to ignore. Growing up, all my friends had joked about how hot she was, but it had always been harmless. She was Tom's mom, off-limits, untouchable. Until now. She stood there on my doorstep, wrapped in a long coat, her dark hair falling over her shoulders. Her perfume hit me first, something warm and intoxicating. I felt my pulse quicken, and I hated myself for it. "Mrs. Reynolds?" I asked, confused. "Is everything okay?" She smiled, but there was something different about it, something that made my throat tighten. "Hi, Alex. I hope I'm not interrupting." "No, not at all. Do you need something?" She hesitated, then stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. My brain was scrambling to catch up. She'd never come to my house before, and Tom hadn't mentioned anything about her needing help. "I was actually hoping to talk to you," she said, sliding her coat off and draping it over the back of the couch. Underneath, she wore a fitted blouse and jeans, the kind of outfit that made it hard not to notice her figure. I quickly averted my gaze, focusing on anything but her. "Sure," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on?" She sat on the couch, crossing one leg over the other. Her confidence was unnerving. "I know this is a bit Unorthodox, she began, but I didn't know who else to talk to. I sat down on the opposite end of the couch, keeping a safe distance. Talk to me about what? She sighed, running, a hand through her hair. It's about Tom. Relief washed over me. Of course, she was here about her son. I was an idiot for thinking this was anything else. Is he okay? I asked. He's fine, she said. It's just, he's been struggling lately. And I know you're his best friend, so I thought maybe you'd know if something's going on. I relaxed a little, leaning back. He hasn't said anything to me. But, I mean, we're guys. We don't always talk about that stuff. She smiled again. But there was still something behind it. Something vulnerable. I'm worried about him, she admitted. But I don't want to be the overbearing mom who pries into his life. You're not overbearing, I said without thinking. You're just a good mom. The words hung in the air longer than they should have, and she looked at me in a way that made my chest tighten. I cleared my throat, desperate to break the tension. I'll check in with him, see if he needs anything. Thank you, Alex. Her voice softened, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and charged. I could feel her eyes on me, and against my better judgment, I glanced at her. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a friendly visit. There was something unspoken between us, something dangerous. Her gaze lingered a second too long, and I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. Are you sure you're okay? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She leaned slightly toward me, just enough to close some of the distance. Can I be honest with you? My throat went dry. Yeah. I'm lonely, Alex, she said, her eyes locking onto mine. Tom's. Grown up, my husband and I barely talk anymore, and I don't know. I don't feel seen. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I knew this was the moment I should say something to shut it down, to steer the conversation back to safe territory. But I didn't. I couldn't, because deep down, I understood exactly what she meant, and that terrified me. I should have stopped her. I should have stood up, thanked her for coming by, and walked her to the door. But instead, I sat there, frozen, as her words sank into me like hooks. I don't feel seen. I knew that feeling too well. Jen and I had hit that point where our conversations were about logistics, who's picking up groceries, what time the bills were due, whether the car needed an oil change. We hadn't had a real, intimate conversation in months, and the more I stared at Mrs. Reynolds sitting on my couch, the more I realized how much I craved exactly what she was offering. Attention, validation, the warmth of being desired. She shifted, closer. So close I could smell the faint hint of wine on her breath. Her hand brushed against my knee, and my body betrayed me, tensing under her touch. I felt the rush of adrenaline, like I was on the edge of a cliff about to fall. You don't have to be lonely, she whispered. Her words hung in the air, heavy and electric. I knew this was my chance to say no, to create distance. I could have stood up, apologized, and sent her home. But instead, I said the stupidest thing imaginable. I know what you mean. Her hand lingered, and I didn't push it away. We sat there in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the TV in the background. My mind was a battlefield, torn between guilt and desire. Every logical part of me was screaming, "Stop this now! This is wrong. She's your best friend's mom." But another part, one buried deep in the parts of me that felt ignored and forgotten, whispered, "No one has to know." "Alex," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to betray her own hesitation. "I didn't come here planning for this." Neither did I, but knowing that didn't make it any easier to stop. When her hand slid further up my leg, I felt the last shred of resistance slip away. I leaned in without thinking. It wasn't a calculated move, it was instinct. Our lips met in a slow, tentative kiss, as if we were both testing the waters, waiting for the other to pull away. But neither of us did. Her hand slid up to my chest, and I felt the warmth of her body pressing against mine. The kiss deepened, and suddenly, all the tension that had been simmering between us exploded. For a moment, nothing else existed. Not Tom, not Jen, not the weight of what we were doing, just the heat of her lips, the softness of her touch, the way my body reacted like it had been starved for this. But as quickly as it started, reality came crashing down. I pulled back, gasping for air like I'd just surfaced from drowning. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking. I can't do this, I stammered. This is wrong. Her eyes searched mine, wide and filled with something that looked a lot like regret. I'm sorry, she whispered. I shouldn't have. No, it's not just you, I said, standing up and pacing the room. I let it happen. I wanted it to happen. That was the worst part. The realization that, deep down, I had wanted this. I had wanted her to see me, to make me feel something, again. But now, standing there in the wreckage of what we'd almost done, the guilt was suffocating. I should go, she said, grabbing her coat. I didn't stop her. I couldn't even look at her as she headed toward the door. But just as she reached for the handle, she paused. Alex, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything. And then she was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the overwhelming weight of what had just happened. I sank back onto the couch, running my hands through my hair. What the hell was wrong with me? How did I let it get that far? I told myself it was just a moment of weakness, that it didn't have to mean anything. But the truth was, it did. Because even as I sat there drowning in guilt, a part of me didn't regret it. A part of me replayed that kiss, the warmth of her touch, and wondered what would have happened if I hadn't pulled away. That night, I barely slept. I kept tossing and turning, haunted by the image of her standing at my door, the feel of her lips on mine. I kept imagining what would happen if Jen found out, or worse, if Tom did. The guilt gnawed at me, but so did the temptation. The next morning, I tried to bury it. I went about my routine like everything was normal, convincing myself that one kiss didn't have to ruin my life. But it wasn't that simple. As the day went on, I kept checking my phone, half expecting a message from her. Part of me hoped she wouldn't reach out, that we could pretend it never happened. But the other part, the part that was still craving the attention, wanted her to. I lasted 2 days before I broke. I was sitting at work staring blankly at my computer screen when I grabbed my phone and sent her a message. Me. Hey, I'm sorry about the other night. I stared at the screen, waiting, my heart racing with every second that passed without a response. And then, my phone vibrated. Mrs. Reynolds. You don't have to apologize. I've been thinking about it too. My hands trembled as I typed my reply. We can't do this. You know that, right? Her response came almost immediately. I know, but that doesn't mean I don't want to. And there it was, the line we were about to cross, the point of no return. My mind told me to delete the conversation, block her number, and never speak of it again. But instead, I typed, me. What if we met somewhere? Just to talk. Even as I hit send, I knew there was no such thing as just talking. But I needed to see her again. I needed to understand why this was happening and why I couldn't seem to stop it. Her reply was simple but devastating. Mrs. Reynolds. Tonight. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, barely able to focus. When I got home, I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection like I didn't recognize the man looking back at me. What was I doing? What was I risking? But none of those questions stopped me from getting in my car that night and driving to the small bar on the outskirts of town, the one where no one would recognize us. When I walked in, she was already there, sitting at a booth in the corner, nursing a glass of wine. Her eyes lit up when she saw me, and for a moment, all the guilt melted away. I slid into the booth across from her, and neither of us said anything. We just sat there, the air between us crackling with tension. I nearly couldn't finish, I admitted. "I'm glad you did," she whispered, her fingers brushing mine, across the table. I knew in that moment that this wasn't going to end with just drinks. I could feel it, like a storm building on the horizon. I was standing on the edge of something dangerous, and all it would take was one step forward. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted to stop myself from falling. I don't know how long we sat there in that dimly lit booth, our hands inches apart, the weight of what we weren't saying suffocating. Her eyes met mine, and I could see it. She was waiting for me to make the first move, to either walk away or take this further. My heart was pounding, and my mind was screaming, "Turn back now. You'll destroy everything." But I didn't move. I just stared at her, trapped between the man I used to be and the man I was becoming. "Do you want to leave?" she asked softly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it hit me like a gunshot. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah." She grabbed her purse, and we walked out of the bar together. The cold night air hit me as we stepped outside. But it did. Nothing to clear the fog in my head. We didn't speak as we walked to our cars, but when she stopped at hers, she didn't open the door. She just turned to me, waiting. I knew what she wanted. And the truth was, I wanted it too. I closed the distance between us, my hand brushing hers before I leaned in and kissed her. This time, there was no hesitation, no second thoughts, just the heat of her lips and the feeling of everything else, fading away. When we pulled apart, she whispered, "Follow me," and I didn't question it. Her car led me to a small motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where people go to be forgotten. The neon sign flickered overhead as she parked, and I pulled in next to her. My hands were shaking as I killed the engine. Part of me still expected to wake up from this, like it was some nightmare I could snap out of. But when she opened her car door and gave me that look, half anticipation, half fear, I knew this was real. We checked in without a word, like we were accomplices in some crime we weren't ready to confess to. The room smelled faintly of stale, cigarettes and cheap air freshener, but none of that mattered once the door shut behind us. She dropped her purse on the nightstand, and for a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the same war raging inside me. But we'd gone too far to turn back now. When I kissed her again, it was desperate. Like we were both trying to drown out the guilt with each touch. Clothes hit the floor, and, before I knew it, we were tangled in the sheets. For a while, the world outside didn't exist. There was no Jen, no Tom, no consequences. Just the two of us, lost in something we couldn't control. But when it was over, and we were lying there. In the aftermath, reality crashed back in like a tidal wave. The silence was deafening, and I could feel the weight of what we'd done pressing down on me. She was the first to speak. "Are you okay?" I laughed bitterly, running a hand through my hair. "I don't think okay is the right word." She propped herself up on one elbow, her fingers tracing small circles on my chest. "We don't have to regret this, Alex." But I already did. The guilt was eating me alive, and I knew that no amount of rationalizing could change what we'd done. I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I don't know how to face Jen after this," I admitted, my voice cracking. "And what about Tom? If he ever finds out—" "He won't," she said quickly, as if saying it would make it true. "No one has to know. But secrets have a way of unraveling no matter how tightly you try to hold them together." I left the motel that night feeling like a different person, someone I didn't recognize. I drove home in silence, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. When I walked into the house, the emptiness felt suffocating. Jen's framed photos smiled at me from the walls, a painful reminder of everything I'd just put at risk. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Reynolds. I saw Jen. I saw the life I'd built crumbling around me. By morning, I was a wreck. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the clock, waiting for Jen to call or text. She didn't, but Mrs. Reynolds did. Her message was short, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. "Mrs. Reynolds, last night was a mistake. We can't do this again." I should have felt relieved, but instead, panic set in. The part of me that craved her attention, that had been awakened by her, didn't want to let go. Me. "I know it was a mistake, but we should talk, just to clear the air." I waited, staring at my phone, praying she'd say yes. But when her response came, it shattered me. "Mrs. Reynolds, there's nothing to talk about. I'm sorry, Alex. Please don't contact me again." And just like that, she was gone. For the next week, I walked around like a ghost, haunted by what had happened. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I avoided Tom's calls, terrified that he somehow knew. I jumped every time Jen's name popped up on my phone, certain that she'd found out. But the truth was, no one knew. The only battle was the one inside my head. I tried to go back to normal, to pretend that night had never happened. But it wasn't that simple. I couldn't look at Jen without seeing my betrayal reflected back at me. Every time she kissed me, I felt sick. Every time she asked if I was okay, I lied. One night, about 2 weeks after the motel, Jen sat across from me at dinner and asked, "What's going on with you?" I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "What do you mean?" "You've been distant," she said, her brow furrowed. "Is it work? Is something wrong?" "Yes," I wanted to say. "Everything's wrong. I've destroyed us. And you don't even know it yet." But instead, I shook my head. "I'm fine, just stressed." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and the guilt hit me like a truck. How could she still love me when I was keeping something this big from her? That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of the secret suffocating me. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I had two choices: confess and risk losing everything, or bury it so deep that it would never see the light of day. The problem was, I didn't know which option would destroy me faster. But deep down, I knew the truth. Secrets don't stay buried, and eventually, whether I wanted it to or not, this one would surface. Because the thing about mistakes is, they don't just disappear, they haunt you, and this one was going to haunt me for the rest of my life.